All right, we are now live. Just going to start collecting folks as they show up from the previous stream. All right, hello. We have a couple people who are already watching. I'm sure others will start filtering over from, I believe it's Madeline and Biblaridian stream. And we're here. Hi, Des Viper. There's Seb and Gregatron. Hello. Nemo's back. Jake's here. Galley Girl's here as well. Hello. We do have chariots. Yes, I've collected a few more subscribers. Always looking for more. Every subscriber adds a little coin of gold under the little red dragon there. Oh yes, I can add things to the bottom here. I did it last time and I immediately forgot. Yes, everyone make sure to like the stream. Take Jake's encouragement. Are we going to see some sweet chariots? We're going to see a decent number of sweet chariots. We're going to see some half-buried chariots. We're going to see some reliefs of chariots. As you can see, I have drawn some chariots. Chariots of fur. Well, not for some spoilers, but there are going to be some fuzzy little guys pulling some chariots. Tea riots. What can tea riots tell us about world building? Some people don't like to be taxed. That's what tea riots can tell us about world building. All right. The little eye in the corner there says 34 people. I think we've collected a decent amount. And I think I'm ready to get started. Madeline's here. Brilliant. Chariots. All right. So, hello and welcome to Lands Unknown. My name is Will, the geographer, formerly known as Ross, and today we're going to explore chariots. We're first going to talk about how to incorporate chariots into world building. We're going to talk about incorporating chariots into world building as part of the World Building Festival. I think this is one of the streams that was always going to be here from the beginning. And we're going to discuss what chariots can show us about building a more immersive world. This video is also a bit of a soft launch for how I plan on presenting things. I'm sure I'm going to have to iron some stuff out. But if you're interested in more discussions about different world building topics couched in the social sciences, I'd appreciate your support with a like and subscribe. First, I want to introduce you to Dove. Dove is a placeholder name for the planet in the world building project here on my new channel, Lands Unknown, where we're primarily going to explore this equatorial subcontinent in the middle of the projection. A little bit about Dove. Just trying to balance these things here. It's an Earth equivalent planet with a similar distance from its G-class star. It has a similar age and atmosphere, obliquity, and eccentricity, all that jazz, to Earth. The significant differences for Dove is that it's a cooler global average temperature, comparable to the last glacial maximum on Earth. And all of the major landmasses of Dove have formed into a supercontinent. I think these two distinctions kind of separate Dove from a lot of the other world building projects I've seen, where the global average temperatures are more aimed towards a nice pre-industrial average before global warming really kicked off. And most land masses on the planet are situated somewhere in the middle of the supercontinent cycle. So you have a bunch of different land masses spread out around the planet. The way I also oriented the land masses produces some interesting effects, which we'll see in a moment by honing in on this subcontinent. So because this landmass is equatorial, the northern coast, western savanna, eastern peninsula, river valley, and parts of the southern rainforests are all tropical. For the Köppen-Geiger climate heads out there, these regions are largely A climates at sea level, and for most of the surface level as well. The northern coast is an AF climate, covered in tropical jungles that receive rain year-round. The western savanna receives precipitation in the winter, because the mountains to the north block precipitation coming in from the north in the summer. And this leads to an AS climate. A lot of this subcontinent is going to have an AS climate with this pattern, which is pretty unique considering we don't see it very much on Earth. But it has to be created through the strategic placement of mountains. As you move south, that savanna transitions through a monsoon climate to the southern rainforests. As the name suggests, there's precipitation all year round, though that peninsula is far enough away from the equator that the climate is more temperate, with cooler summers, more of a CFB, though there are patches on the eastern coast with warmer summers where tropical waters pool. Along the coast of the eastern peninsula, the year-round precipitation gives way to wet winter, dry summer tropical savannas and scrubland. For the interior, the river valley is slightly cooler. It's a couple hundred meters elevated above sea level, but it's still a tropical wet winter and dry summer climate. This moves to the more arid desert basin. The eastern half is hot, but as you rise in elevation to the western portion, the climates cool and become colder, semi-arid, and arid climates. The Iranian Highlands in the center has a much higher average elevation than the rest of the surrounding lowlands, and this lends to a pretty consistent CSB climate, so a warm summer Mediterranean climate. Though varying elevations produce alpine grasslands that are cold steppe, cool summer temperate climates, as well as tundra. You also may have noticed there's a lot of glaciation and ice fields. The Thuringian Plateau in particular, which in some places rises over 5,000 meters, is covered in an ice sheet. But because of how cool the global average temperature is, glaciers and ice fields start to form just over 2 kilometers in elevation. And the alpine glaciers stretch all along the mountain ranges connected to the Thuringian Plateau and parts of the Aravallian Highlands. The most extensive ice fields are in the west of the Highlands, but there are glaciers scattered throughout. The meltwater from these glaciers and ice fields on the subcontinent is very important for the river systems, especially in the summer, since there's so little precipitation for most of the landmass. In the future, I'm going to have a video that explores the physical geography in more detail. But now you've got a lay of the land, so when we start adding more elements like chariots, you can start to see the geography of it a bit better. We're going to turn to the star of the stream here, chariots. So what are chariots? Chariots are a horse-drawn vehicle with 2-spoked wheels. If it has more than 2 wheels, it's not a chariot. If it has solid wheels and not spoked wheels, also not a chariot. If it's drawn by a different animal that's not a horse, not a chariot. Has to be drawn by horses. Other definitions also highlight the importance that the horses are controlled by a bridle, which includes nose bands and cheek pieces, and not systems like nose rings. And this is because nose rings, which are hooked through the nose of the animal, don't provide the same quick response, particularly in situations where you may need tight control of the chariot, of the whole vehicle. They can also harm the animal. They can be ripped out with jerky motions. It's not a great way to control something as fine-tuned as a chariot. That being said, there are a bunch of other vehicles that are drawn by non-horse equids, like donkeys and onagers, or crossbred animals like the kunga. An example of one of these vehicles are the Sumerian war wagons, which you can see to the right here on the war panel of the Standard of Ur. At the bottom here, we can see that each of these wagons is drawn by 4 equids, probably kunga, and controlled with nose rings. Note, they also have 4 solid wheels. So while these vehicles are very interesting, and they're also very important to the Sumerian military system, they're not chariots. This brings up the question of what we call different vehicles in fantasy settings that are drawn by, camels, dragons, gallimimus. I saw armadillos at one point. You may want to develop your own terminology for what we call these different kinds of vehicles. In the same way that we have chariotry and cavalry and camelry and elephantry, you could also have gallimimistry, I suppose. But now that we know what a chariot is and what a chariot isn't, we can talk about the where and the when of chariots. The first recorded evidence of a proper chariot, which you can see in the image here, it's a reconstruction from a Santashta burial dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, found in the southern Ural Mountains. We also have Hittite cylinder seals depicting chariots from around similar time. But what's important about this, in the timing, is that we already have a sophisticated chariot here, which means that they must have been invented at some point at the end of the late 3rd millennium BCE. So the time of the start, by the 20th century BCE, we've already got like the final form of chariots. Beyond this, there are a variety of innovations and developments that happen, but we have reached chariot by this point in time. They come from the Santashta culture, but proto-chariots, which we'll talk about in a bit, were developed between the Don and Volga rivers. And this area is known as the Pontic-Caspian steppe. It's also where the Indo-European homeland is said to come from for the language group. From the steppe, the chariot spread all across Eurasia, where they maintained a very important role as weapon systems, a form of communication, and a demonstration of status and rank. The final recorded use of chariots as a military vehicle is reported in the 1st century CE during a battle between the Romans and the Caledonians, which would be around what is today Scotland. So they were used for the better part of 2 millennia as weapon systems, though in many places chariots became increasingly peripheral in the latter half of the 1st millennium BCE, and we'll discuss a few reasons for that throughout the stream. But now that you know what a chariot is and where they were, I want to discuss what chariots have to do with world building. I think chariots can serve as an important lesson in dealing with anachronism, which describes what happens when elements appear out of time. These elements can be objects, for example, like having a tank in the medieval period, but it can also be the introduction of ideas that are out of place. An anachronism can occur in world building pretty frequently because many depictions of the past in media don't draw from primary sources or from secondary research, but from other media. And this can present issues because genres and mediums all have different ways of communicating drama, intention, and narrative. And those frameworks rely more on referencing other works of media of the same medium or genre. So when designing a world, media can provide a vital inspiration, though a film may present the past in a way that's more cinematic through filmic language than attempts to represent the past with a degree of verisimilitude. A common one for this is when archery is displayed. You have all of the archers holding their bows, fully drawn, waiting to be told to fire at the enemy. This isn't really what archers would have done in the military, and the filmic language that's being presented more has to do with depictions of kind of late modern firearm warfare, like from the Napoleonic period or the American Civil War. Chariots can also demonstrate the ways that technologies fit within broader systems. When world building, you can decide that you want to have a castle on a hill, because you're doing a pseudo-medieval world, and because pseudo-medieval fantasy worlds have knights and castles. You need a castle. But then the question is, what's the reason that castles were built in the medieval landscape? What role did castles fulfill? How did castles change over time? And how are you fitting that within the sort of chronology of your world? And what are the political, social, and economic systems that castles fit into for the people who built them, lived in them, fought over them, and died in them? And so we can kind of explore that through looking at chariots and how they fit into broader technological systems as well as social, economic, cultural, and political systems. Now, nothing comes from thin air. Stuff isn't created from nothing. Everything has a material context and comes from pre-existing things. And that doesn't just include tangible things, but it also includes ideas, social, economic, cultural, political, and religious situations, and they feed into each other, and they produce these sort of ever-changing landscapes across time and space. I think this idea of diachronic change has been really taken up when we talk about the geofiction and the construction of worlds through tools like G-plates, but also through developing languages from proto-languages, introducing that kind of diachronic element and showing how different elements of language for the one that you want to use in your world building project have emerged over time from previous elements. These situations shape the development of technologies, including what is innovated on, and also the negotiation and introduction of technologies that are adopted, as well as when they fade out and what causes them to fade out. So since everything comes from something else, what situation and technologies gave rise to chariots? One of the necessary technologies is the concept, the idea of the animal-powered vehicle. Now, wagons can be found early in Central Europe and West Asia in the late 4th millennium BCE, and these wagons were most likely pulled by oxen. Prior to the development of chariots, the people of the Ponto-Caspian steppe used wagons with cattle in order to exploit the grasslands and carry more of their possessions than they otherwise would be able to carry by themselves from site to site. We also have a variety of vehicles pulled by non-horse equids in North Africa and West Asia, like the Sumerian war wagons, but also carts with solid wheels. They've also found an example of one of these carts in India a few years ago that's quite old. But this idea of taking a domestic animal and using it to pull a wheeled vehicle was already something that was well understood by the people of the Ponto-Caspian steppe at the time. What we see first is the development of these proto-chariots, you can see in the right-hand corner there. This was developed by the catacomb culture, and as I mentioned previously, it's located between the Don and Volga rivers, and one of the predecessors or within the broader cultural area of the Santashta. The design is quite similar to the Santashta. We can see the yoke, we can see the design of the cab, and the position of the wheels, though we notice that there are a lack of spokes. We can also see below it an example, a pictograph of an early chariot. And something that's notable about it is that early chariots were often vehicles designed for one person. And scholars suggest that chariots first emerged on the steppe as working technologies for hunting and herding, rather than a weapon system for warfare. Just taking a pause here. From Crystal, is there a difference between cart and wagon for terminology? Wagons have more than 2 wheels. So when you think of a wagon, they probably have 4 wheels. Carts tend to have 2 wheels. Flying chariots. Yes, that is also a good idea. They don't have wheels, though, so I'm wondering how you'd get those to function. I guess if the dragon flies fast enough, you can kind of keep it airborne behind. Or would that be just a small plane, a glider, that goes behind the dragon? All right, back to Dove for a moment. The Dovians, the people who inhabit Dove, who live in the western savanna, engage in horticulture and irrigation agriculture. They also hunt these rotund herbivores pictured below, usually by corralling them into large traps made with stone fences, as these herbivores migrate in large numbers between the wetlands on the banks of rivers flooded by the summer meltwater to the transient savanna lakes and watering holes filled by winter rains. Sometimes they keep these animals in corrals for extended periods to access the various things they harvest over a longer period, which include meat, bones, skins, and, as they start to domesticate them, their milk. After domesticating these animals, they harness them on solid-wheeled carts, which work quite well in the relatively flat western savanna. Nope. Boop. Sorry, just lost my place because I have to jump back and forth in order to kick this thing around. Yeah. So they harness them on these solid carts, which work quite well in the relatively flat western savanna to transport produce and other goods. From here, the technology system of the animal-powered cart is spread to the northern coast, as well as to the east into the southern jungles. The second fundamental part of a chariot is the horse. Now, all contemporary domestic horses are descended from the Dom 2 lineage. Dom 2 meaning secondary domesticate or secondary domestication. The Dom 2 lineage began in the first half of the 3rd millennium BCE in the Yamnaya culture, which is associated with the Proto-Indo-European languages who lived in the Ponto-Caspian steppe. Horses began as quite local domesticates. They were domesticated and spent time on the steppe for centuries before spreading very quickly at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. Within 200 years, they had radiated quite quickly. An important part of this radiation is that the Dom 2 horse developed two mutations. One of them helped increase its back strength and carrying capacity, which also helped it for pulling various carts and vehicles. The second made them much more social, docile, and resistant to stress, which is very useful when you're using them for things that can get the adrenaline going, like hunting and herding, and perhaps taking them into battle. Both of these mutations suggest selection for traits beneficial for either pulling vehicles or riding. Some keen-eyed viewers may also remember that this period of time between 2200 and 2000 BCE is the speculated transition period between a proto-chariot and a chariot proper. So we have some, possible connections here. Now, talking about the size of horses very briefly, there's some poor arguments or myths that float around about the size of horses and how people had to ride them prior to some larger breeds being developed, especially in the medieval period. But, Bronze Age horses are usually between 13 or 15 hands tall, and 14 hands today is usually the cutoff height between a pony and a horse. So they weren't that small. We also know that, for example, Roman cavalry, in the Iron Age, were riding horses that were around 14 hands tall. So a horse that's 14 hands tall could certainly carry someone into battle. We also know that people could ride a Bronze Age horse like you're able to ride a normal horse. We have an example here of a Przewalski horse. I'm sorry, Polish viewers, which is a wild horse and a cousin of the Tarpan, which is the wild ancestor of the domestic horse. This horse here, Vaska, was tamed out in the far east of Eurasia to be ridden, which you can see can be ridden quite like a normal horse. So there was nothing stopping people from riding horses or using them to pull carts or chariots or other things from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Back to Dove. So these animal-powered carts spread to the east. They eventually made it to the river valley and then up into the Aravallian Highlands. The reason for such this ponderous route into the Highlands is kind of twofold. One is that there aren't many connections between Highlanders and people from the Western Savannah. The mountain ranges between them are quite tall, almost 2 kilometers or above in some places. And these passes can be quite treacherous in the summer. And of course, there's lots of snow and precipitation that can fill these passes with sudden avalanches from fluctuating temperatures. Glaciers can collapse. And in the winter, these passes are bitterly cold and obscured by blizzards. This is a big problem for these draft animals that were adapted to the tropical lowlands and wetlands in the Western Savannah. They are not suited to going over these freezing passes, and when people try to take them over, they tend to die of the cold. The other issue is there aren't many established roads or trails between the Western Savannah over the mountain passes into the Aravallian Highlands, so the carts just can't make the trip. So instead, it's going to be people on foot making these treks over the mountains. And in order for the carts to get there, they have to take some time going around the south of the subcontinent. But there's an issue with this kind of full adoption of the system of the animal-powered vehicle for the Highlanders. The people of the Aravallian Highlands live in a semi-nomadic hunter-gatherer and horticulturalist society. During rainy, snowy winters, they congregate in the protection of valleys and established winter village sites. In the summer, they travel up to alpine meadows and plateaus to hunt and forage. The animal-powered carts help them carry more supplies from site to site, which also facilitates the reduction of annual sites that they visit in a year to one winter village site in the summer and their alpine territory. But as I mentioned, these draft animals don't do very well in cold weather. The Highlands, on average, are over half a kilometer in elevation, with certain parts of their territories exceeding 1 kilometer. And this can lower the temperature with elevation by between 3 and 6 degrees from what it would be at sea level. So in the summer, this may be fine for the draft animals, but in the winter, it can get quite cool at nights, even in the valleys. It can get as low as 5 degrees quite frequently, with cold snaps below 0, which can kill entire teams of draft animals. So what is the Highlander solution to this? And if you thought the other critter was cute, we've got our little pseudo horse here. Their solution is to domesticate a species of gracile, grazing herbivores that they frequently hunt. This little pseudo horse. They harvest these animals for their meat, hides, and bones, as well as for the woolly fibers in their manes, which they use to make blankets and other clothing. These tamed animals are then harnessed to wagons and carts to replace the draft animals from the western savanna. Since the pseudo horses are faster than the draft animals, these carts allow them more effective mobility for hunting, as well as facilitating a transition to herding, which transforms their society from a hunter-gatherer society that does horticulture on the side to a society with winter horticulture and year-round pastoralism, focusing on herding these pseudo horses. And this leads to a debate that is currently happening in the literature, which is what came first, horse riding or horse-pulled vehicles like carts, wagons, and then eventually chariots? I've summarized these two positions as the horse before the cart for riding and the cart before the horse for the vehicles. On the one hand, for the arguments that horses came before the cart, we have a bunch of depictions of humans riding equids. During the 3rd millennium BCE and the 2nd millennium BCE, people were clearly aware that you could ride equids at the time that chariots were developing. I have some of those images later on when we talk a bit about cavalry. There's also been some research on human skeletons that suggest horseback riding prior to the invention of horse-drawn vehicles. This is because sitting on horses for long periods of time throughout the day can actually change your skeleton, and that can be seen in the archaeological record. We also have the evidence here that horses were large enough to ride, and that people had been riding horses that large for quite some time. Even, Vasca, who was not a Dom 2 horse who had those mutations, could still be ridden. On the other hand, there is the cart before the horse. In this argument, scholars say that early chariots were work vehicles for herding and for hunting. We have this line of development from wagons to proto-chariots and eventually chariots, which I have sort of drawn out for you. Scholars argue that when wild horses were being tamed, it could be quite dangerous to try to mount and ride them. They could be quite vicious animals, and getting a hoof to the face could be the end of it for a willing rider. Prior to the Dom 2 mutations, wild horses may have also been better suited to pulling vehicles rather than for riding, because one of those mutations increased their carrying capacity. Riding horses, especially putting up too much weight on their backs, can deform their spines and cause a lot of problems for the animal. One author in particular, Taylor, with the 2024 citation there, compares the attempts to tame or domesticate zebras that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries to wild horse domestication on the Ponto-Caspian steppe. While none of these attempts to domesticate were very intense or successful, we can compare them to the successful program to breed domesticated silver foxes that happened in the 20th century. Nothing like that was happening with zebras. But what they did manage to do was to tame zebras so that they could be hooked up to carriages or wagons. And so Taylor and some other authors have suggested that this is a much safer thing to do, where you could tame an animal and control it from a vehicle where you're further away and you don't stress it out. However, on the other hand, we know that you could ride wild horses like Vasca, and that Dom 2 horses were large enough to ride. So there's a lot of competing evidence here. and the possibility that people were perhaps riding horses and also using vehicles at the same time. As for Dove, in this situation, I decided to go with the cart before the horse. But in my other personal world building project, I picked the horse before the cart. Both of these are valid directions to go if you're wanting to chart the innovation of technologies in your world. There are multiple paths to the development of the same technology, and they can be equally valid, opening up different opportunities for your own world building and considering and speculating different possibilities, including worlds with no horse equivalents at all. I know Edgar over at Artifexian, for his world building project on Kretok, placeholder name, you know, is considering going in that direction. Back to the Aravian Highlands, we can talk about their society a little bit. The smaller social unit in the Highlands is the band. The band shares a common summer territory for pasturing their herds, and they come from the same valley, or smaller connected valleys. In the winter, band members go back to their winter village sites, which are organized by kin group, to tend and harvest from their gardens during the wet season. In the summer, the bands reform and go up into the alpine pastures with their herds. Everybody in the band is responsible for their pastoral mode of subsistence, and because chariots are the fundamental working tool for herding and hunting, everyone is familiar and trained to make, maintain, and operate them. It's what they do. It's what their lifestyle depends on. Just like for anyone who's done farm work, if you live on a farm, everybody farms. Once children are old enough, they help out on the farm and start participating. Everyone has chores and work that they have to do to keep the farm functioning. For the Highlanders, they have a similar relationship with their herds and their chariots. Their chariots are also made out of materials that are relatively common to them. The wood that comes from the copses of trees in the forests that they have access to, copper and eventually bronze from the plentiful tin that they have in the Highlands that were created through the orogenies that produced their landscape, and they use them in order to reinforce the wheels, spokes, axle, and frame. They use the skins from various animals they hunt or from the pseudo-horses themselves, and instead of being an elite weapon system, their chariot is something that's a common everyday technology. Therefore, for their chariot teams, the driver and the javelin-throwing warrior here are members of the same band who are friends or kin, either close family or distant cousins. They've trained and worked together to manage herds and on the hunt. There aren't assigned teams, and people have preferences to who they work with, but a Highlander may not always have a choice depending on who's available to hunt or herd. The way that a chariot transitions into a weapon system for the Highlanders is in raids, to steal pseudo-horses from herds of other bands or to fight for territories of pasture, especially in years where there's been drought or there are cold snaps that kill grasses. While certain neighboring bands have friendly relationships, engage in mutual aid or diplomacy to share their pastures, not all lean times can be handled diplomatically. And with that, we are going to talk about the logistics, socioeconomics, and the politics of chariots that we saw. So, what would someone who's in a farming society need to supply a chariot? Well, every chariot has at least 2 horses in a team. Some chariots have 3 or 4. For activities where you'd want to have a chariot for long periods of time, for herding, delivering messages, or warfare, especially for long battles, you'd want to have multiple teams of horses to keep them fresh. You also don't want to tire out your horses with travel by pulling the chariot as you're going from place to place. So a lot of settled militaries tended to use donkeys or mules to pull the chariots. And here we have a clay tablet from Tel Halaf, as well as a translation from the Hittite, I believe it's the Hittite, from Dornauer into German, Tel Halaf is a site in northern Syria, and this is clay tablet number 48, and it's referred to as the military equipment for 10 men tablet. And the first three things include one chariot, 4 horses, and 2 donkeys. And the analysis for this tablet suggests that the 4 horses would be in 2 teams in order to pull the chariot, and that the 2 donkeys would be pulling the chariot for travel to keep the horses fresh. When used as a military system, chariots carry often 2, but sometimes 3 or 4 passengers. One is a driver, or charioteer. The other is an archer or javelin thrower. And then you can have more passengers. Usually they're additional melee warriors or 2, and we can talk about the purpose of them a bit later. In farming societies, where your subsistence does not require everyone to know how to use and maintain and produce a chariot, because you need to know how to farm and maintain your farming lifestyle. You don't have extra time to learn how to do chariots. You're going to need specialists in order to make them, including bowyers for the weapons, particularly for archers. You need carpenters and wheelsmiths and grooms, animal trainers and metal workers, in addition to hundreds of spare parts to service the chariotry, especially if you're taking them on campaign. Now, following this thread of what chariots and state militaries required, just looking at Egypt, for example, in order for Egypt, the various dynasties, to produce and maintain chariots, the state needed to fund a variety of different workshops to manufacture them. An example of one of these workshops is depicted here on a 2nd millennium BCE tomb painting, where they have these workshops that they produce chariots in. The materials they needed, though, came from far and wide. The tin for bronze often came from Central Asia or Europe. They also needed wood that was good for chariot frames, preferred elm and ash, and those had to come from forests throughout the Mediterranean that are not in Egypt. They also needed to get horses, which needed to be drawn from the cooler steppes far to the north or from highland regions. And for each chariot, you need to have at least half a dozen horses. This is for your team and your replacements, as I mentioned before, but you also need horses for breeding to maintain and grow your supply. And this really took time, especially because, horses did not do too well in hotter climates. Mares could have difficulties bringing pregnancies to term. The forage and pasture wouldn't necessarily be the best for them. And any land that you start to dedicate in these agricultural societies to pasture for horses takes away land that you would otherwise be using to produce food. In addition to the specialist craft people who are necessary, you also need charioteers and archers or javelin throwers. If the people of the society don't grow up hunting from chariots or driving chariots to herd animals, then they need the time and resources to learn and practice those skills. And the solution for this problem, for the various hierarchical polities that employed chariots, was to create a chariot warrior elite. In the case of Mesopotamia, this was an easy transition from the warrior elite who used their war wagons. They're essentially able to adopt the chariot technology and transpose it onto the social and political system they already had. These chariot warriors and archers usually came from the aristocracy, and the charioteers, their drivers, were often their younger relatives or retainers or their clients. These polities needed ways to control the chariot warrior elites, because chariots were an important part of their military system and vital to the political power of these different polities. And to do that, a lot of these systems centralized chariot manufacture and maintenance in palaces or mansions. If a chariot broke, it would have to go there to get fixed. If an elite wanted a chariot, then their lord would have to assign them a chariot from that location. And because the production and maintenance, and perhaps the storage of these chariots when they weren't at war, was in a centralized location, elites had to come to the palace to participate in training and hunting and racing. And by doing those things together, these elites were able to make a bond as a class or a strata of that society, which could help form closer ties among this aristocracy. The importance of chariots and the movement of chariots from the palace to the hinterlands and the residences of other elites necessitated the establishment of road networks for travel between these different centers, which then had an added benefit of funneling and guiding trade and the movement of people as well. But the roads also have another use, something that Sean here points out. If you can imagine an elite in a chariot riding down the road with farms on either side, rural workers in the fields, and they see this elite warrior with an exclusive weapon made of exotic materials, pulled by animals that they could never afford to own, that's elevated above the rest of them. This really demonstrates the dominance of the ruling ideology, as well as a way to communicate the elite status of the aristocracy over the lower class peoples that over which they ruled. Carrying on from the discussion of the elite, we can talk about chariot politics. Chariots were a very important part of politics for much of Eurasia for several millennia. The access to chariots changed the political landscape. So the growth of the Hittites and their empire is linked to an early adoption of chariots. The growth of the Hurrians and the Mitanni is linked to their chariots. The Kassites, who were a group that invaded Mesopotamia from the Zagros Mountains, had access to chariots. And the Hyksos, who were probably a Semitic-speaking people that invaded Egypt and established their own dynasty, introduced chariots from West Asia. So access to chariots provided the ability for groups of people to overthrow the political order and establish new polities in the political landscape. And chariots were such a vital part of the military that they had this potential to change things so wildly that access to horses was a vital concern. The number of chariots became so important to polities because not just because they're for the military, but also because they legitimized that polity. States started to be judged by the number of chariots that they had, and in several different places that employed chariots, they actually referred to how strong states were and ranked them based on the number of chariots they were able to field and maintain in battle. Sometimes there were hundreds and sometimes thousands, depending on the time and place. But we know these large numbers of thousands of chariots are reported, particularly from dynasties in China. Back on Dove. As chariots descended out of the Aravallian Highlands, stark political changes impacted the rest of the subcontinent. Chariots spread east into the river valley, which was quite different than the Highlands. They live in hierarchical societies, in urbanized cities where every neighborhood has at least 2 clubs. Every adult belongs to one of these clubs, and an adult can only join the club of one of their parents, who usually come from the same club. But an inductee needs a sponsor who is not related to them in order to join one of these clubs, which establishes patron-client relations between the sponsor and the inductee. The chariots are introduced from the Aravallian Highlands when the Highlanders in the footlands decide that they don't just need to raid one another, and that they can also raid the river valley. And so, the agricultural city polities from the river valley start to adopt chariotry as a response in order to defend themselves from these fast, maneuverable vehicles. But in that adoption, chariotry is transformed. The actual structure of the chariot starts to change. The river valley and the desert basin have a much flatter terrain, so they adopt different designs that prioritize speed and less on stability by building lighter chariots and shifting the axle further back. The urban societies of the river valley have a lot of specialization, so the expert craftspeople are able to produce higher quality chariots whose sole purpose is for warfare. In the river valley, large citizen cities are surrounded by a rural agricultural hinterland, and the cities can marshal a lot of resources in order to field many chariots. And while, as I mentioned before, the charioteer and javelin thrower of the Aravnian chariots are kith or kin, the river valley interprets this through their own lens and incorporates it into their patron-client or sponsor-inductee relationship. Because the clubs are responsible for outfitting their members to serve in a militia during conflict, the clubs also start taking the role of producing and maintaining chariots. And where in the Aravnian Highlands, pretty much everyone knew how to use a chariot weapon system, the training for the use of chariots in the river valley becomes a specialized skill. So club politics then elevate people within their clubs to the status of charioteer or chariot archer. And then chariotry becomes an essential part of warfare in the valley and basin polities. Successful citizen city polities require chariots, and they also legitimate the clubs. The clubs in each of these neighborhoods compete to see how many chariots they can have on the field of battle and to see how many chariots they can defeat in combat. Chariot racing and other chariot sports become important within the citizen cities to such a degree that they build large stadiums for all the different clubs from the different neighborhoods to compete against one another. But in order to do this, they need a lot of animals for new chariot teams, and they also need to import tin for bronze, both of which come from the Highlands in the Western Desert Basin. So then these polities start to compete amongst themselves for access to bronze and herds from the Highlands. But how would the citizen city polities of the river valley or the bands of the Aravnian Highlands actually use the chariots in battle? We know that chariots played a very important role in the Bronze and Iron Age battlefield. We have numerous textual as well as the visual evidence that chariots were deployed quite frequently and held very high status. We can see here a relief of a Hittite war chariot from the 9th century BCE. And a very common motif is that the horses are trampling over one of their enemies. You see this all over West Asia and North Africa. Over the next few reliefs, you're going to see more chariots trampling over people. But even though we know we're very important, the chariots are very important, we don't know much about the specific tactical battlefield use of chariotry. There's very little scholarly consensus on the finer points of things, and we don't have, for example, a manual that says to us specifically how chariotry is supposed to be used in battle. We have strategic discussions about how one would use chariotry from a couple places. We have manuals for how to train horses to be used as chariot teams. We have numbers of chariots that are deployed. We have some information about the logistics of chariots, which I've shown. We've also found large caches of chariot parts, as well as manufactories where people made chariots. But the actual tactical use and deployment on the battlefield is something that there's not much hard evidence for. So keep that in mind. What we know for sure about chariots is that they were largely used as mobile javelin or archery platforms. Particularly in Asia and North America, it's usually an archery platform. In Europe, it tends to be a javelin platform, and there's evidence that in the Ponto-Caspian steppe, based on Sintashta burials, that the missile points that have been found in those burials with chariots suggest javelins. One of the arguments that Anthony makes is that the bows that have been found or depicted on the Ponto-Caspian steppe from this period of time are self bows. These bows are quite large, usually over a meter tall, and they'd be quite difficult to use from a chariot. So this is why javelins would be preferred. However, around 2500 BCE, recurve composite bows, these smaller bows that are made from multiple different materials and bent the other way, were kind of innovated in North Africa and West Asia. So when chariots came down, they started to incorporate the bow into the weapon system instead of the javelin, though there are reports of the Hittites still using javelins. But As missile platforms, what would chariots be used for? They would be used to screen an infantry force. So prior to infantry making contact with an enemy, the chariotry could soften them up. Chariotry could also harass the flanks or the rear of an infantry force. But in order to harass enemy infantry, allied chariotry would have to engage in skirmishes against enemy chariotry. From some experimental archaeology where teams have built reconstructions of chariots that have been found in archaeological digs, and they have put a charioteer in the cab, and they have got equestrian archers to shoot from these chariots. They found that chariots probably used tactics similar to what's known as the Canterbury Circle, where the chariot would drive close to an enemy, loosing arrows or throwing javelins on the approach, and then retreating away, kind of like a drive-by. And whole squadrons of chariots could engage in these kinds of circles. We also know that chariots as skirmishing platforms were supported by infantry in some cases. These infantry are probably light or medium infantry that could jog alongside chariots or wait a little back and rush forward if they were needed. So, example, in case a chariot they were attached to was damaged or fell apart in the field. They could also rush forward if an enemy chariot was damaged on the wrong side of the battle. And this may have been why some chariots started to include additional warriors, so you would have someone to protect the chariot in case of damage, but primarily you protecting the elite and the charioteer. Another use for the infantry could be if the chariot saw an opening, they could charge for a breakthrough. And that leads to chariots being used as shock weapons. So chariots were certainly used for chasing down fleeing enemies. We've seen enough of these reliefs. They could have also been used for charging enemy formations. We have a lot of visual and written depictions of chariots trampling infantry or reports that they break formations. We have these from the Chinese manuscript, the Liu Tiao. Apologies. Chariots are the feathers and wings of an army. This means to penetrate solid formations, press strong enemies, and cut off their flight. So penetrate solid formations is usually interpreted as being used as a shock weapon to charge enemy formations. But much like later cavalry, chariotry would want to charge infantry units that were already engaged in combat, those that are wavering, those that are lightly equipped or less disciplined, preferably charging them from the flank or the rear. A head-on charge of chariotry into heavy infantry would probably go about as well as it did for cavalry, which is not very well at all. We also have evidence that sometimes chariots were made specifically, as primarily written evidence, that chariots were made specifically with blades under the cab. And they would be there so that after an enemy is trampled by the horses, the blades would also cut them, just in case the horse hooves didn't do enough damage. The final use of a chariot on the battlefield that's been proposed is the battle taxi. This was developed from readings of the Iliad, where chariots were used to deliver these heroes onto the field of battle. But we need to be skeptical about this, since Homeric texts were composed hundreds of years after chariots were utilized in warfare in the Aegean. So they're not describing an extant weapon system being used in battle. We also have evidence, for example, from the Mycenaean site of Pylos, that over 500 arrowheads were stored with chariot supplies. This suggests that they would have been used as skirmishing platforms. We also have depictions of Mycenaean chariots being used in hunting scenes, where there is an archer in the chariot hunting animals, which connects it back to its original use for herding and hunting vehicle. But this doesn't mean that chariots weren't used to deliver infantry in battle. So one of the descriptions we have of how chariots were used on the field that's quite detailed comes from Caesar's Gallic Wars from Book 4. And this is how he describes their mode of fighting. So Firstly, they drive about in all directions and throw their weapons, and generally break the ranks of the enemy with the very dread of their horses and the noise of their wheels. And this is evidence of them being used as skirmishing platforms. And then, when they have worked themselves between the troops of horse, they leap from their chariots to engage on foot. The charioteers, in the meantime, withdraw some little distance from the battle, and so place themselves with the chariots that, if their masters are overpowered by the number of the enemy, they may be ready to retreat. Some interpret this to mean that the warrior in the chariot would actually jump on the yoke between the two horses that are on the chariot. I wouldn't really support that reading, since Caesar is talking about the Britonic military system, and in that system they used infantry, chariotry, and cavalry. So troops of horse can refer to cavalry that are skirmishing in tandem with the chariotry. But what happens is the warrior leaps down from the chariot, charges into battle. Meanwhile, the charioteer positions it so he can get away. And Caesar seems impressed by this, because chariots both provide the speed and maneuverability of a horse on the battlefield, as well as the firmness of infantry, the ability of infantry to actually take and hold positions. So what we have here isn't so much of a battle taxi, where the sole purpose of the chariots is to deliver a warrior to the field of battle, but they did operate kind of like mounted infantry. So they would deliver a warrior into combat. And in the case of the Caledonian and the Britonic chariotry, the javelin throwing warrior would have been a warrior elite. He would have been wearing a helmet, a mail shirt, had a large shield, an iron sword, and he would have effectively functioned as heavy infantry. So the ability for chariots to deliver large groups of heavy infantry to somewhere they may be needed on the battlefield to break through the enemy could be something very devastating. Didn't work on the Romans, though, because their system kind of functioned on having mostly heavy infantry. So, with all that being said, chariots are largely used as skirmishing platforms, but some systems also include delivering heavy infantry or charging the infantry. Some chariots would probably be more suitable for some things than others. In China, they talk about having assault chariots in addition to wing chariots. We also see heavier forms of chariots being developed from the Hittites that carry more passengers, which could potentially be more useful for delivering infantry on the field of battle, rather as more maneuverable skirmishing platform like we see the Egyptians use. But much like other weapon systems, the use would probably vary across time and space. And the last little portion of this, going to discuss some counterfactuals before I look back at questions and have a bit of a conversation. But why not cavalry, right? Why invent chariots at all? As I've said before, and as you can see here, when chariots were being developed from proto-chariots, people were already riding equids. I think the BMAC seal impression there, the BMAC culture is from Central Asia, largely in what is today Afghanistan. And if you note the date of the seal there, between 2100 and 1800 BCE, that's right around the time that chariots are kind of coming into their own. So why use them if people were already figuring out, how to ride equids, whether they're horses or non-horses? There's also the interesting situation where chariotry and cavalry served side by side for centuries throughout Eurasia. So once cavalry was introduced, they didn't immediately supplant chariotry. They continue to fight side by side, even though the number of chariots gets smaller and smaller. There are a couple reasons for why not cavalry. One, low horse populations. Outside of the steppe and certain highland regions, there is a constant struggle for them to acquire enough horses. And when the first cavalry actually emerged, which are equestrian archers, we can see here two panels from the same relief in the throne room of Ashurbanipal II. The Neo-Assyrians kind of develop what we can see as the first use of cavalry. They are essentially doing chariots without the cab. You still have two people needed to operate equestrian cavalry. You can see in the background of this lower panel that you have a squire who is holding the reins while the archer in the foreground is loosing arrows. So it's not any more effective horse-wise as chariots are. And there's another weakness to this system, in addition to being kind of cumbersome, that the equestrian cavalry here carried much less ammunition. So we can see that there's a quiver on the back of the archer there. The squire may have also carried an extra quiver, but on many chariots, you can actually see two quivers on either side. So that's a lot of ammunition that chariots could be able to continuously loose into an enemy. And then, it wasn't really until the 7th or 6th century BCE that you start getting unassisted equestrian cavalry, where people are riding horses and shooting arrows without somebody else steering for them. So it took a while to actually figure out this technology of how to do it. And that's part of where this anachronism comes from, right? Like, we see cavalry and we see it as such a simple idea, but it's a very complex technology that took quite a while to actually invent and innovate upon. And when you may think, oh, I just need one horse. Okay, now that we have, unassisted equestrian archers, you just need a horse. But that's not the case. Cavalry forces often use a lot of horses. You have your war horses that you ride into battle, but you don't want to tire them out, so you have a riding horse that takes you to the battle. You also have draft horses to bring your wagons and your supplies like food. And then frequently they also had pack horses to carry their stuff, because you don't want to tire your riding horse out by carrying your armor and your weapons and those sorts of things. In the medieval period, knights, for example, would often have at least 3 horses. They would also require a bunch of people to help them, like grooms and squires, and all those people would also need horses so they could keep up with the knight. Other military systems, like the Mongols, they could have as many as 5 or 6 horses per person. So these cavalry-oriented systems need a lot of cavalry. If you only have 1 horse per person and your horse dies or injures itself, now you don't have cavalry. Now you have an infantryman who's not trained how to be an infantryman. Though there are suggestions by the horse before the cart side of the scholarly debate that horses could be used for mounted raiders. So the raiders would jump on the horses, they would ride their horses to the spot they wanted to raid, and then they would jump off their horses. Someone would have to stay back and hold a certain number of horses. I believe in the 18th and 19th century for the British, for mounted infantry, they tended to have 1 person for 4 horses. So if you had 20 mounted raiders, you need 5 people to stay behind to hold the horses. So that is one way that speculated that horses could have been used prior to the innovation of equestrian cavalry by the Assyrians. And with that, we're going to return to Dove one last time so we can chart the spread of chariots beyond the river valley. So while the pseudo horses are not unused to warmer temperatures, daytime highs in the Highlands regularly reach 24 degrees Celsius during the summer, and it can get even warmer. There's a real threat of chariot teams dying of heat exhaustion from the daytime highs of 27 to 30 degrees in the hot desert and savanna. So herds were slowly established in the foothills of the Thuringian Plateau in the colder regions of the Western Desert Basin. The shaggy mane of the Highland varieties thinned as the lowland breed became more heat tolerant, even though the hembras, the female animals, still needed cooler temperatures to successfully carry a pregnancy to term. From there, chariotry spreads east from the river valley to the peninsula and then to the southern rainforests. Through mountain passes between the desert basin and the western savanna, and over the Cavalicians into the northern coast. The Highlands maintains its importance as the primary source of herds for the southern peninsula and the western savanna. Dangerous trade routes, as I mentioned before, through the mountain passes are explored and established for access to bronze, chariot experts, and teams in exchange for lavish goods from the lowlands. And this radically changes the Highland societies. Eventually, the leeward side of the rolling mountains of the Haxian Hills are cleared to create pastures for breeding small populations to offset the need for the Highland trade. The higher elevations of the desert basin is a vital supply for herds to the northern coast, but there's also a thin strip of land along the Cavalician range in the shadow of glaciers and ice fields that's used to raise herds. And with that, we've made it to the end of the presentation portion. If you'd like to see more of Dove as I continue to develop it at Lands Unknown, please give me a like and a subscribe. I've also got my Ko-fi in the description. Doing this research, spending all the time putting this together and drawing it to share this knowledge about chariots and the other stuff takes a lot of time, and any support would be appreciated. Before I forget to, got a list of references that I'm going to flash up so you can come back and find them later. I'll also drop them into the description once the video is uploaded onto YouTube. Oh yeah, I just got one section for these references. Okay, I'm going to go back and start looking at some of these comments. Oh, Langtime Studio, I think that's David. Oh, is that the kind of monotreme water buffalo? I was kind of looking at kind of a miniature variety, I think, that's in Indonesia. I've been calling them platyras, but I haven't developed, I've been developing the conlang for the different groups. So once the conlang's been presented, we'll have terms coined for the animals. That's a bestie right there. Oh yeah, I can show these. It's a bestie right there. I did try to make cute little animals. That was one of the goals. Quite fantastic drawings. Well, thank you so much. I spent so much time on these. Yeah, I spent a lot of time on these. I doodle and sketch and stuff, but I haven't done very much painting or digital painting, so this took a lot of time. Then we have Jake. Przewalski. That's my best attempt at this moment. We have to get Maddie to try to say that sometime on stream. Yes, we should. Madeline knows her IPAs now. I would wear the same jumper as the pseudo horsey. Yes, I was looking at bison. I was also looking at llamas and their ancestors. And I wanted to add a visual element to make them a bit more distinct. In addition to the crest that they have, which is kind of a hardened kind of monotreme bill that kind of worked its way back. I also wanted to work in having fibers coming from the same animal. just so I don't have to have like a sheep or something in addition to this. Yes, the duck-billed pseudo horse. Excellent, thank you, Bib. Like nukes or aircraft carriers now? Yep, certainly. They have quite the ability to kind of disrupt the landscape around them. Are slings common for chariots? No, slings aren't common for chariots. We don't have. I haven't seen any evidence that slings were utilized with chariots. They tend to rely more on the javelin or the bow. Slings also tend, they tend to rely more on the chariot or the bow. Bladed chariots aren't just a grimdark fantasy invention. No, they seem to be innovated in a couple different places and utilized against infantry. They I think one of the more popular places that you can find citations to them is in Xenophon, the Greek general there who confronted them in West Asia when fighting against one of the Iranic empires. From James, do chariot horses also work in farming and such? Or are they just going to battle? For the settled people who live in states with cities, who do a lot of farming agriculture, chariot horses would be distinct animals that are specially trained to be a part of a chariot team and pull a chariot. You would want a different kind of horse to be trained to be doing those kinds of tasks around a farm. So if you wanted to have horses on your farm, you'd have to have more horses than you would otherwise need if you just needed them for the military. Well, a horse rider would have to steer and shoot. But they didn't immediately think of that. It took them a bunch of steps in order to get there. I'll join your Patreon as soon as I got all my squirrels in a row. Oh, thank you so much, Gregatron. Yeah, I'm open for more questions. I can go back to any of the other discussions that were happening. This was the first stream concept for this festival. Yes, I believe it is. I think it emerged from a bit of a rant I went on in either your Discord or Artifexian's Discord. Oh, I see. I may have cut out once or twice earlier. That's where the T-Rides came from. I see. I see. See, now I wasn't in on the joke. Let's go back to one of the points on chariots, and specifically about the need for horses. Chinese dynasties actually were very horse hungry, and they usually had to get horses from the north, from like Inner Asia, essentially, or North Asia. But they were often fighting against various groups from that area, so they wanted to have an additional source of horses. And in order to do that, they actually sent some expeditions all the way to Central Asia, to the Fergana Valley, which is now kind of in the border area between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And they remarked on how beautiful the horses were there. They never ended up actually setting up a trade deal with the people of the Fergana Valley, but they did manage to go out there to make this huge trek all the way to Central Asia through the Tarim Basin in order to request horses. Seb, now I need to revisit my own weapons of war from my worlds and deep dive into their history. Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I think that delving into that history can, and where they come from and how they change as they move around, can really lend themselves to producing a world with some of that messiness that we were talking about in the religion stream, and fleshing it out a bit more, perhaps coming up with different ways to use these different weapon systems than you may have otherwise thought about. Um, something else that I wasn't really sure whether or not to include in the main presentation is that there are a lot of conversations that I see online about chariots that specifically talk about their efficiency, like how fragile they were, how often they broke, lending themselves that, they had to be used over relatively flat lands. They couldn't be used in more mountainous areas, areas with a lot of obstacles like gullies and valleys and canyons and things like that. Though, to be quite fair, that is very true of cavalry as well. I mean, cavalry is quite limited in its ability to navigate on the battlefield. And it's also true of contemporary, like modern weapon systems that are used. For example, tanks, right? Like tanks are pretty limited in the kinds of terrain they can go over. They have to be not only flat, but also dry. Tanks can get stuck in the mud. Mud can gunk up all the machinery. Dust as well. Dust can cause a constant need of repair for tanks. There's a huge logistical system that supports the deployment of some of these modern vehicles. And I think, some people in the future may look back at tanks from the late 20th and early 21st century and say, well, why did they even use these? These are super inefficient. Why didn't they make this clear, logical jump that we have with, 2020 hindsight? And, and it's not like the folks who use chariots didn't recognize this, especially in some of the Chinese manuals on how to use chariots. They specifically say, like, you have to make sure that you check how deep the water is before you bring your chariots to a river. You want to check the ground before you choose where you want to fight in order so you can make the best use of your chariots. Don't deploy your chariots in really hilly or mountainous terrain. Rely on infantry in those situations. They also found ways to deploy chariots in hilly and mountainous terrain. I mean, the Hittites who live in the Anatolian Plateau, it's quite hilly there. The Armenian Highlands as well. A lot of uneven terrain, and they still managed to use a decent amount of chariotry. And when they had mountain passes they needed to get chariots over, they actually would just unhook the chariots from the horses, and people could carry them. So you could carry them over a mountain if they needed to. James asks, was it still better to be on a chariot versus on foot then, in terms of danger or dying in battle? I guess if one had the choice, it would probably be better to be on a chariot. Chariots are quite maneuverable. They could get out of dangerous situations more quickly. And the people who would be on the chariots would be better armed and armored. So they would, also have a better self-preservation. A lot of times in militaries that use chariots, the infantry were commoners who were more expendable than the elites who would be using these chariots. A chariot was also a big investment of material, both in the horses, the food for the horses, all of the people who needed to spend all the time laboring to put it together. So the people who were in chariots were also very cognizant of how much a chariot costed for it to use. But that being said, charioteers could also die from their chariot malfunctioning and flipping. They could perish fighting other elites. They could perish if infantry overtook them. There are a lot of ways for a charioteer to fall in battle, though the societies themselves kind of celebrated chariot warfare and chariot skirmishes and didn't necessarily pay as much attention to what the infantry were doing. Very similar to in the medieval period, how there was a lot of attention paid to what the aristocratic warrior cavalry was doing, and not so much attention was being paid to what the lower class infantry were doing on the battlefield. And of course, I have a lot more chariot facts. Chariots used in hunting too. How would that affect world building? Yeah, so one of the theories was that chariots were first used as hunting vehicles. Some of the early pictographs that I showed earlier on in the stream, I can just go back to that. So we have one scene here, and this is kind of a mythic hunting scene where a chariot, quote unquote chariot, is being pulled by a sphinx hunting another sort of mythological creature. So they portrayed mythological hunts. They also have these pictographs of early chariots surrounded by animals that would commonly be hunted. So, situating the chariot within this kind of natural scene. We also have a lot of reliefs and art from like Egypt and the Mycenaeans and the Hittites and other groups where charioteers are using their chariots to pursue animals while the archer is hunting. We have some really nice reliefs of Assyrian reliefs in particular where they are hunting lions. So for hunting, we can use it two ways. One way, like the Arabian Highlanders, they can use a chariot as a part of their subsistence system, which included a lot of hunting. But we can also talk about hunting as the way that we can also talk about hunting in the way that elites use their chariots to hunt. Because hunting things like lions or hunting a variety of other animals was often a leisure activity that elites got to do. Lower class peoples, maybe hunting fowl and other small creatures, but it is pretty common leisure activity for elite warriors to jump up on their chariots and go hunt deer or lions or other creatures. And we have a lot of evidence for that. So that's just another thing to consider is how do these weapon systems and other technologies work in multiple different dimensions of whatever constructed culture that you're building. And thank you for all your questions, James. There we go. What was another bit to kind of follow up on? Oh, one of the other parts for the battle taxi, when chariots have Thanks, Madeline. There we go. The chariot stream lived up to the hype. There were certainly a lot of chariots. One of the other speculative uses of the supporting infantry that are sometimes depicted, we have supporting infantry noted in Egypt as well as in China. And something really interesting about this is that in China, we have burials of squads of chariots where there are 5 or 6 chariots, and they are buried with, I believe, 25 to 30 infantry. So this suggests that a squadron of chariots, at least for that period of China, was 5 or 6, and they would have an attachment of 25 to 30 infantry. And one of the other uses of the support infantry is if the chariots deliver their heavy infantry into battle, the supporting infantry could then follow up and engage, kind of provide the mass of the formation after deploying the various warriors. Faux show. Many chariots. This stream is a major military power. Yes, it is a 400 chariot power. And the chariots, well, chariots necessarily didn't continue to be used by various Chinese dynasties. They did develop the idea because at some points they actually used chariots as a barricade, essentially. So they would unhook the chariots from the horses and line them up side by side so that if an enemy wanted to approach them, then they would have to get over the chariots so it could provide a defensive position. These developed over time into certain specifically made defensive carts. And when various Chinese dynasties went up to fight the equestrian, the cavalry in the north, they would bring all of these different carts with them in order to form impromptu defenses, in that way trying to neutralize the advantage that the cavalry had against them. And in other places, chariots continued to be used for prestige, for example. In Roman triumphs, there were frequently chariots. They were also used for sporting events. We have the chariot races in Rome. And when some of these Roman chariots, in particular for the races, for the gladiatorial games, were reconstructed, what was interesting is they have 4 horses. Some of them have 4 horses, which makes it more difficult to control. But those outside horses out on the outside of the team aren't actually pulling the chariot, just from the way that the chariot's designed. So it makes the chariot more difficult to actually steer, but it doesn't provide any additional speed. So it may just be something cinematic that the Romans did as a way to kind of provide some, extra drama, especially because they enjoyed chariot crashes, and adding more horses that a charioteer has to control can make it more difficult. Why did the chariot stop being used? Was it just because of horseback archery? No, it wasn't just because of the horseback archery. So there were periods of time when chariots fell into disuse because the economic networks that were needed in order to support them, collapsed. And we see this in examples like the Bronze Age collapse. So the Bronze Age collapse, we see kind of a systems collapse over a period of time of the networks that kind of globalized the Mediterranean world. And that led to a bit of a decline. However, the Neo-Assyrians who appeared after that continued to use chariots, so they kind of revived them. Like, chariots continued to be used. Another reason why chariots declined was that especially for agricultural societies, the states that were necessary in order to kind of stratify society in such a way to make chariots possible could collapse or dissolve. So periods in time when you go from one more centralized polity that's able to support a lot of chariots. If that polity fails, collapses, becomes weak, or splits apart, it could have a lot less resources to be able to dedicate to chariotry. So those are two systems reasons. From the kind of social, economic, and political side. From the military side, as you started to have unassisted equestrian archers, they are much more maneuverable. So if you want to use them just as skirmishers, as like skirmishing cavalry, they tend to be much better than chariotry. And as you got more and more horses, then you could start to mass equestrian archers in a more effective way. You could have more of them, and that was another element. The final thing was military systems were changing in the Iron Age, and one military system that made a huge impact were the Romans. So what we tend to see with military systems with chariots or chariotry, cavalry, and infantry is that a lot of the infantry tends to be light infantry. So these warriors tend to have shields and spears, maybe an axe or a sword. A helmet is a good suggestion, but they're rather lightly armored. The wealth would be more focused into the cavalry and the chariotry. When they came into contact with the Roman system, which revolves around a core of heavy infantry, big shields, a lot of armor. There's the Lorica Stigmata, which is really popular, but many Romans just wore mail. When the chariotry and cavalry came into contact with the light infantry, came into contact with this system, they weren't able to defeat it. The spread of the Roman military system really changed. It developed in response to the people they were fighting, and the people they were fighting also changed what they did in response to the Romans. And what we see is that when the Romans go in and fight people, especially in Europe, who have chariots, after a little while, they tend to abandon chariots and adopt different military systems in order to better deal with the Romans. And that's, also true of other places. When in East Asia, for example, in the Chinese dynasties, when the steppe people that they were fighting against adopted cavalry kind of wholesale, chariotry didn't really match up against it. And so they needed to change things and mix them up. So, there are a lot of reasons for why these different changes happen. And they're going to be different from place to place and vary over time. As I mentioned, states could abandon chariots and then pick them back up again. And then later, I should probably throw that up. And then, later incorporate more cavalry, and then the chariots just slowly decrease. Thank you, Sai. Oh, Magpie. I'm now imagining a world where the shift away from chariots didn't happen as much, and you eventually got chariot gunners. Yes, there are a variety of horse-powered vehicles that resemble chariots. Eventually you get like chankas, I guess they're called. And these were sometimes these were horse-drawn carriages with machine guns facing out the back, and they were kind of famously used by the Black Army in the Russian Civil War by the Makhnovists in what is now Ukraine. So they had kind of that system. There were also Roman systems of torsion field artillery. And this torsion field artillery would be put on a cart and drawn by mules or horses. And these, though, like you wouldn't ride them. The horse or the donkey would just pull them, and then they would shoot them from a stable position. But that was kind of more of like a field artillery. You could also imagine having a variety of different, horse-drawn weapons that could be deployed on the battlefield. Yeah, of course, Magpie. There's also an example of Zamburak. Zamburak were originally, they were crossbows that were put on the backs of camels, and these were used kind of throughout the Islamic world, actually quite famously by the Pashtuns, who are one of the major groups in Afghanistan. And they would put large crossbows on the backs of camels, and the camels would lie down, and the camels would provide a stable firing position for the big crossbows. This eventually developed into the camels having cannonades on their backs. So you would have a big cannon or a small musket that you could use firing from the back of a camel. And there are a variety of things that came after this as well. So this system kind of continued to evolve. But animals pulling carts or being the platform for another weapon system is something that's quite underdeveloped. That's freaking awesome. Yes, I think it's really quite cool. What was the system after the cannon that the Zamburak used? Gatling guns. Right. Once Gatling guns were invented, the Zamburak had camels with Gatling guns on their back. So, you'd have someone riding the camel to a position, jumping off, getting the camel to lie down, and then using it as a Gatling gun position. I know it's like, what about chariots pulled by camels? Camels have their own very cool military histories in the ways that they've been utilized within weapon systems. And we haven't even talked about elephantry, which is a bit outside my wheelhouse. But elephantry played a really big role in South Asia, what is now like India and Pakistan. And of course, famously, elephants made a sort of lackluster attempt to get involved in fights against the Romans, passing over the Alps. I don't think a significant force didn't actually make it over in order to actually participate in the war. So if you have animals that don't include horses, you could still come up with ways to use them as weapon platforms. If you had a really large animal, you could use it as a weapon platform with a siege engine on top to bring that as field artillery. You could also put a bunch of people into a platform on top of a large animal and kind of maneuver the animal around as a skirmishing platform too, although it would probably be much slower than a chariot. And what's interesting is then you can speculate the ways that militaries would respond to the developments of these weapon systems. Oh, thank you, Jackie. Yeah, I Dynasty Warriors elephant mount. That is a blast from the past. I remember playing Dynasty Warriors 3 and 4, I think. That kind of dates me as a millennial. Yes, there's a group in Siberia that developed reindeer riding. There are a couple places that ride reindeer. There are some groups in parts of Russia and China, as well as Mongolia, who do reindeer riding. The Sami as well in Finland also do reindeer riding. And the reindeer themselves are kind of like semi-domesticated, which is a very interesting, which is a very interesting snapshot that we have. Because in most cases we have domesticated animals and then wild animals, but in this case there's kind of an interesting middle spectrum period. So reindeer riding could also be something cool. And what's cool about the reindeer, of course, is they have horns, which could be something that could add a lot of ornamentation to combat. Though you may have to put the reindeer further apart so their horns don't kind of knock together when they move around. I believe it's more of like a joke. Like, I mean, it's more of like a thing for kids. It's more of a ride, but you can also ride llamas. I mean, llamas are totally capable of being ridden, though, usually it's at most, I think, a quarter of the weight that a llama can carry of its own body mass. And because llamas are so small, usually they can only carry people who are, more smaller and slight, or children largely. But Andean communities do have yearly races where their kids race llamas. So the kids jump on llamas and race them, which I think is very cute. And llamas are one of the inspirations for the design of these pseudo horses. Oh, yeah. And of course, I've got llamas on the shelf behind me. I have the llama here, which is actually a little flower pot who has some succulents in him. And then I've got a little llama here who is my little llama bank. You can put little coins in them. Yes, it is very important that we have llamas. Madeline and I agree on this. Madeline, did everyone see the llamas in your stream? Did you show them your big llamas? Okay, well then you will have to when we do the closing stream. We need to talk about the llamas. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and for the background environments and stuff, I'm I have periods where I sketch and draw and practice, but I think doing the channel and doing the videos definitely gave me a way to kind of consistently practice over the last month and a half of putting these visuals together. So continuing this project, I'll continue drawing and making my own assets for the videos. I'm going back and I'm seeing that there are Chariots and chariotry. There we go. That's good. Chariotry. All right. There we go. And that's part of the fun of looking at ancient militaries, is having the infantry, cavalry, chariotry, elephantry, camelry, and all of the other categories that we can add re to at the end. I think we got 15 minutes for the end of the stream. If there's any other questions folks would like to ask last minute, I'm also I'm also free to talk about stuff for physical geography. I did help Artifexian develop his process for manually modeling temperature and climate for the World Builders log. But before I answer any last minute questions, I have put the link in the description to the next stream in the World Building Festival. Again, if you enjoyed the video and you'd like more and see it as I improve and we continue to explore Dove and the Dovians who live there and all the different shenanigans that their little pseudo horses get into, drop me a like and a subscribe. I have 2 streams tomorrow. I've got one tomorrow morning with Bibloridian, where we are going to explore polities and state formation for the Neotex, which are his sapient critters on Tira 292b. And then I've also got the final stream, the wrap-up stream, where Madeline and I are going to do some world building and talk about tropes in romantasy and what's the other one? Paranormal romance, like urban fantasy. Yeah, and that's going to be really fun. I had a whole phase in high school where I was reading all sorts of urban fantasy and paranormal romance, so that's something I'm pretty excited about. What do we have next in the World Building Festival? Madeline, do you know what the next stream is supposed to be? The next stream is tomorrow. This is the last stream of the day. Oh, all right. Yeah, the Blender speed run. I know Edgar's been preparing for that. He's been doing a few tests for the Blender speed run. It is ungodly early for me too. It feels like we have 24 hours of world building streams over this weekend. I didn't even think there was a pause between mine and the one that came next. I think the next one, yeah. Well, Madeline, you did a really great job putting all this together and reaching out to folks and organizing the different streams. Madeline's alpaca stuff is amazing. It is. It's really big. I've got some all up there. I have a little herd of alpacas and llamas. None of them are as big as Madeline's, sadly. I look forward to seeing. Yeah, I think I'm going to be seeing a lot of these later. I've been spending a lot of time getting ready for the streams that I've had. I've only been able to catch some glimpses of a few. And yesterday, I was working at the university, so I wasn't able to catch very much. We are counting on it. And very look out for the big llamas. Excellent, thank you. Just for the references as well, if you're interested in learning more about chariotry and horses and how they developed, there are two texts here that I would really recommend. The first one would be Anthony's The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, published in 2007. It is a great survey that brings together language and historical linguistics, as well as the archaeology, and both the studies of different material cultures, as well as the study of the horse as well, and how it's changed over time. And the horse and wheel language is both one of the strong arguments towards the Kurgan hypothesis and away from the Anatolian hypothesis about the ancestral kind of homeland of the Proto-Indo-European languages, but it is reasonably accessible for an academic text and actually introduces you to a wide variety of different sites and sources and finds that are exceptionally cool. But there's been a lot of work that's been done since then. And while Anthony is on the riding came first side, this next one I'm going to recommend by Taylor from 2004, Hoofbeats, how horses shaped human history. Taylor is more on the cart first side, and that riding came later. And Hoofbeats is actually written for it's a survey. It brings a lot of different work together. It's really quite an achievement. And it's also written for the lay audience. So you don't have to be a social scientist or an archaeologist or anthropologist or do cultural geography in order to engage with Hoofbeats. It's written really well, and the little drawings in there are absolutely fantastic for each of the chapter headings. So I'd highly recommend both Hoofbeats and the horse, the wheel, and language if you're looking for two things to kind of read and get into. And that's kind of the struggle sometimes with, I don't know, for world builders, a lot of which are not, a lot of people do undergrads, get their bachelor's. But for those who don't have ready access to academic sources and journals and those sorts of things, it can be kind of difficult to get the resources that you need to kind of follow some of these debates and engage with new evidence and new ideas and new arguments as they come out. But luckily, and it can also be kind of dense, right? Like people are referring to specific methodologies, specific frameworks. They're referring to specific sites and using acronyms for certain cultures, which I did a little bit in here. I'm guilty of, which they kind of assume everybody already knows. So something like Hoofbeats and to a little lesser extent, the horse, the wheel, and language are really effective at communicating that kind of information. And I've been doing my best, particularly working with Madeline when providing some insights for her culture building series to give some, broader sources that are written primarily for, lay audiences or just people who are not in the specific subdiscipline or discipline. So it's a lot more approachable. Magpie recently graduated and very much missing institutional access. Yeah, it can be a bit of a problem. I've been lucky to continue to be in academia for, I don't know, over half my life now. So I count myself really lucky to be able to continue to access these. And I think part of what I get to do is share that with everyone else, primarily through this channel going forward, hopefully, and by working with other world builders like Artifexian and Bibloridian and Madeline, of course. Yes, I have shelves worth of research well made me buy. I provided suggestions. You're the one who said you wanted to read the hardcover books. But I did notice, that there was a lot of pop science or pop history or just kind of inherited ideas that world builders had and shared that weren't really relying on good science or kind of the most recent ideas. Some of the ideas that world builders use when they're constructing cultures or worlds, come from over 50 years ago. And while they're common, they're not mainstream in the disciplines anymore. Anytime you say Taylor, I always think it's AJP Taylor, even though I know better. Yeah. For Hoofbeats, it's what's his name? William Taylor. Yeah, so another Will Taylor. That's a bad habit too, just referring to authors by the last names. but I still occasionally come across AJP Taylor. He's the British historian, I think. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Kate. And he wrote something. He wrote a book in the early 20th century about Italian unification that I have perused. Yes, brilliant. There we go. Something that I'm really interested in talking about at some point is the development of polities over time, and spending more time talking about nation states. And I think Italian unification is a pretty striking example of the development of a nation state, and still how fractured Italy is today. All right. For those of you left watching, we are now at 6:59. This is the end of the day for the Chariot stream. 6:59 p.m. Pacific time for me, where it's the end of the World Building Festival for the day. Thank you for staying up late in Lands Unknown. Again, if you have the time to drop a like, a subscribe, and a comment. Thank you all so much for spending the evening with me. 10 p.m. here. That's lucky. You get to go to bed. So have a great night, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you, for me, bright and early tomorrow to talk about states and polities.